We all have that one friend who's the coolest person we know. They're so cool that hanging out with them makes us feel cool, even if they know we aren't as cool as them, which only makes us like them even more. That cool friend is Tony Stoneham, but we are not Tony Stoneham. We are Sid Jenkins. Sid Jenkins is us. Unpacking the character of Tony made me realize that while Tony is the character we are supposed to start the show's journey with, and ultimately relate to, he's a rare breed and probably unrelatable to 95% of the kids watching the show. In my real life as a teenager, I was stupid and insecure and just an overall mess. I mean, who doesn't cringe looking back sometimes? That's why it's clear to me that unlike Tony, Sid is the everyman. Throughout the entire series, we see Sid be one of the most vulnerable characters. From all the characters, he is the most pathetic in his initial state. He is messy, unprepared, and unmotivated despite the world telling him to be otherwise. Sid is the protagonist because he is literally all of us when we are at our lamest and can't seem to reach our goals. Skins really invites their viewers to connect with Sid immediately when Tony, our narrator, tells the group that the first real problem of the show is Sid being a virgin and him needing to get laid to stay friends with Tony. Sid doesn't even know this is a problem until Tony notifies him and pushes Sid to be more concerned. There were literally no problems until Tony declared there was one. It's amazing. Reminds me of someone. Sid, being the everyman, just goes along with it in a similar manner that the average person doesn't necessarily fight back against the forces that be. Most conform and settle as much as possible, so with a friend like Tony, who's constantly wanting to control more, he sees Sid as his connection to this sense of uselessness. Sid is never someone Tony would think would challenge him or threaten him in any way. As a show of its time, Skins was really coming out in the era of indie sleaze, Urban Outfitters, and the mainstream commercialization of touchscreen cell phones with texting and Wi-Fi capabilities. Like, I remember being so cool amongst my friends for knowing how to download Bedrock by Young Money as a free ringtone. This was really the early days of social media sites like MySpace, Facebook, and Twitter. No one knew what the fuck was going on, but everyone seemed so young and cool doing it. We all began to be hyper aware of our image and how we were perceived by others in a much bigger way than normal people are used to. So naturally, with the new cool TV show like Skins premiering with the intention of connecting to the youth, they wanted to make sure the characters fit the trends of the era. Tony fits those trends, so without hesitation, he's front and center. However, in a 2009 interview with the televisionary blog, one of the show's creators, Jamie Brittain, when asked who his favorite character is, admitted that Sid is him by proxy, saying, "Sid, first time around, he's based on me. Everyone loves Sid." With that being said, you can start to understand why a character like Sid would be the main character of a show like Skins, which at its heart is about insecure teenagers and their relationships. When you start with a character like Tony, he seems to have it all figured out and has to focus on other people's lives because he's pretty sad as a teenager. Thus, with a character like Sid, you have so many opportunities to explore any and all issues, and that they did. However, Sid's life is not as cool and aspirational as Tony's is. Sid's life is low-key miserable, and if the show were to begin with him, we'd be wishing Sid was more like Tony.
Why could you not be like?
Look at how Sid dresses, his hair, his glasses. You wouldn't hang a poster of Sid on your wall. No offense to Sid. Skins began when we were familiar with high school shows like The OC, One Tree Hill, Veronica Mars, and Smallville. All the kids in these shows looked like Hollywood celebrities, and rightfully so, since they were. So, knowing this is what kids were watching, Sid would have been the worst choice as the de facto main character. So clearly Tony was the most fitting to tell the story, but Sid's issues were easier for teens to connect with. But let's imagine a Skins premiere starting with Sid. All the same things would happen, but Sid would be our initial point of reference. You would just see Sid pathetically waking up to his dad yelling at him and throwing a phone at him. This random guy, Tony, tells him all this shit he needs to do, and Sid is trying to get a wank in when Tony puts him on hold. I mean, look at the state of his room. I think with Sid's character, we see him in almost every emotional state as a human being. He never tries to be anything more than he is, and I think that is what is refreshing about Sid. He doesn't try to put on a front like Tony does, and is authentically himself, even with things other people might find embarrassing. It's like all those moments you'd want to not include in a television show about your teenage years. Jamie Brittain was able to bring those up through Sid and make it feel awkwardly relatable. It's funny because the actor who played Sid, Mike Bailey, noted that his friends used to say he was just like his character. So it goes to show that there isn't a clear line between Sid's character and his actor compared to someone like Tony Stoneham and Nicholas Hoult.
At first, I didn't relate to him at all. I found it really difficult because, you know, I'd never been the alpha male leader of the group. You know, cockiness was something in my household which was, you know, severely frowned upon.
He's probably the person that's most different from their character, really, because Tony's such a sort of complex, like psychologically messed up, nasty character, and Nick's not like that at all. Nick's just a really lovely boy, but he is really good at stuff in a slightly annoying way.
There are massive kind of differences between me and Sid, even though all my friends say that I'm very much like Sid. I don't know what they're talking about.
I feel that Mike and Sid are quite similar. I think Mike's more, Mike isn't sort of such a downtrodden person by any means. He's much more confident, but he's got like the thing like the beanie hat that Sid wears. That was Mike's. And Mike came to his auditions and he had that hat on and stuff. So I think there's some similarities, and they're both sort of. I think they have quite a, like, Mike's very funny and Sid's very funny.
Sid was immediately portrayed as the stereotypical virgin friend. This trope can be traced back in modern media, all the way to some of the early teen-centered media in the 80s movies, such as Porky's, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, The Last American Virgin, and 16 Candles. This trope continued in the 90s with the iconic Ty Frazier in Clueless.
Why am I even listening to you to begin with? You're a virgin who can't drive.
In the 2000s, we're met with more comedy classics, including Freaks and Geeks and American Pie, where we explore full plots revolving around characters losing their virginities. Again, notably, most of these examples are from strictly comedies and not necessarily a teen drama, where things might be a little more emotional. This takes Sid's portrayal of the teenage virgin to a different place and makes him more realistic and less of a character that we are so used to seeing. I think this helps to take the shame out of it as well, since Sid nor his friends other than Tony make a big deal about it. Not only does Sid hold the virgin friend stereotype, he also has the slacker one as well. Everything in his life is kind of fucked. I mean, his dad hates him, he's an only child, he has no girlfriend, his grades are crap, and he's not very talented at anything. But he has friends, and for Sid, that is enough. Even just the fantasy of being in a relationship with Michelle comforts Sid enough to not pursue the more obvious options for himself. Sid is lazy, he's laid back, and he goes with the flow. He doesn't like to shake things up too much, but there's always a calm before the storm. Sid begins the show with his dad waking him up by slinging insults at him, along with the phone. Right from the start, it's clear things aren't looking great for Sid. Tony and Sid's dads both are jerks, but their behavior reveals an important difference. Tony provokes his dad intentionally, while Sid provokes his dad merely by existing. This dynamic reflects how Sid doesn't try to change himself to suit anyone, not even his parents. His dad never holds back when addressing Sid's shortcomings, and this likely contributes to Sid's own blunt and often unfiltered honesty. Sid's passivity becomes a defining trait throughout the show. Tony makes it clear that Sid's virginity is an embarrassment to him, pressuring Sid into losing it, but Sid doesn't try to change himself for anyone. Not because of some deep moral stance, but because it's simply not in his nature to go out of his way for things he's not genuinely passionate about. However, one thing Sid does care about is sex, and Tony uses this to his advantage. Even though Sid doesn't believe there's anything inherently wrong with him being a virgin at 16, he's willing to entertain Tony's plan because it aligns with his interest. Yet, true to form, Sid still doesn't put in enough effort to follow through. Tony assigns Sid two tasks: get weed and have sex, and Sid fails at both. His mistakes aren't due to a lack of intelligence. He's one of the more sensible members of the group, but rather a lack of motivation. Tony's tasks are oddly connected. Sid is sent to a brothel to pick up weed, with Tony suggesting they'll need to get a girl high to convince her to sleep with Sid. When Sid finds himself surrounded by sex workers, he doesn't take the opportunity to have sex with one of them, even though he's supposedly motivated by his excitement about sex. This moment hints that Sid is pursuing something deeper, even if he doesn't fully understand what that is. Sid's passivity affects all of his interaction. He allows the wonky-ass mad twatter to unload more weed than he can handle, misses the chance to have sex with Cassie despite her expectations, and passively endures his dad's constant berating. Unlike Tony, who challenges authority at every turn, Sid accepts his lot in life, believing himself incapable of change. In every situation, Sid only needs to exert a small amount of effort to stand up for himself, but even that feels like too much. The fallout from the stolen car incident shifts the group's focus. When the car ends up in the harbor, the bigger issue isn't the theft itself, but that Sid left the weed behind, putting him in trouble with Mad Twatter. The group bonds over trying to help Sid, making something of a collective project. When Cassie enters the mix, recovering from an eating disorder, Tony and Michelle decide she's the perfect match for Sid. This pairing feels reductive and slightly insulting to both Sid and Cassie, but fits within the group's dynamic. Sid's loyalty to Tony is frustrating, especially because Tony degrades Sid constantly. The friendship is clearly one-sided, benefiting Tony at Sid's expense, while others recognize this imbalance. Only the girls call Sid out on it directly. Despite Sid's passive demeanor, his blunt honesty surfaces in key moments. He's the only one who openly addresses Cassie's eating disorder and how it impacts him, showing a level of care beneath his nonchalant exterior. This honesty resonates with Cassie as it shows someone genuinely notices her struggles. Sid's bluntness also appears in his interactions with Zhao, where he pokes at her insecurity by calling out her lack of an active sex life and how focused she is on her music, indirectly challenging her femininity. While Sid isn't trying to offend anyone, his honesty often strikes a nerve. With Michelle, Sid's honesty and persistence are less productive. She firmly friend-zones him, but Sid clings to his fantasy of being with her, refusing to let go even after she shuts him down. Later, when it's time for Sid to confront Matt Twatter, he doesn't step up, leaving Zhao to deal with the consequences. It's Zhao who ultimately resolves the situation, not Sid. Even when Sid and Michelle are physically attacked by a group of girls, he barely intervenes, once again passively allowing things to happen. Sid's grades also become a point of concern when his parents are called into school. However, Sid skips his next class the moment his friends apply even a little pressure to smoke weed. He also remains oblivious to Cassie's growing feelings for him when she asks him out on a date. He reacts as though she's offended him.
I think we should go on a date.
Us?
We don't have to have...
Okay. Yeah.
And later uses being grounded as an excuse to avoid the date. Sid's constant procrastination and passive behavior are mirrored in his habit of wanking. This symbolizes his sexual frustration and the broader sense of stagnation in his life, a cycle of constantly doing something but achieving nothing. Adolescence, much like adulthood, can trap people in a loop of inertia, and Sid embodies this. Cassie tries to show Sid that he has the power to take control of his life, but he continues to play the role Tony has defined for him, hopelessly pining after Michelle. Sid's family dynamic sheds light on his personality. His dad's harsh treatment has crushed Sid's confidence, while his mom's timidity has taught him a kind of learned helplessness. Sid internalizes his dad's criticisms, believing he's useless. Sid begins to grow when two pivotal moments force him to confront his passivity. Cassie's hospitalization, which he blames himself for, and his mom leaving his dad. These events make Sid realize he can no longer be a passive participant in his own life without losing everything that matters to him. He starts to combine his parents' strengths, adopting his dad's directness and his mom's quiet resilience to take control of his life. Sid distances himself from Tony, depriving him of the reactions he craves, and begins to act with more intention. The words manipulation and control are even shown in the final moments of Sid's first episode, underlining this turning point. When it's time for their trip to Russia, out of everyone in the group, Sid is the one forced to smuggle the drugs up his ass like a fucking prisoner. He's clearly uncomfortable. He gets kicked out of his own room by Tony. He also gets caught up in Anwar's Russian love triangle and is the only one who gets repeatedly hurt in the situation. Sid's aware he does it, but finds it hard to break his habit. I think another notable moment of Sid's growth is when he punches Tony in the face. When Michelle finds out Tony cheated with Maxie, Sid is the first person she expects to have known and not told her. Once Sid finds out, he isn't impressed by the allure of Tony anymore, and he and his friends start to see him for who he really is. When Michelle comes over to use Sid as a rebound, he doesn't feel comfortable with it. Instead of passively going with it, he actively stops her, then comforts her when she begins to cry. This displays Sid's sudden growth and how he now knows who he wants, Cassie. When Tony needs Sid's help, Sid tries to resist control, but once he notices he's injured and his sister's missing, Tony's childhood friend pops out of him, and Sid is by Tony's side once again. However, this time, Sid is more assertive and actually stands up to Tony when they start to get into it about Sid realizing how Tony isn't a good person.
You did things because you wanted something, fine. Makes sense. But now you do things because you can! You fuck with people.
Regardless, Sid still steps up for Tony when he is called upon and helps him save Effie, along with defending him against his parents and showing him some sympathy in his lowest moment thus far. When Sid goes to find Cassie, he winds up in the mental hospital where she was staying, but finds out she already left. Eventually, Tony helps him get out and tries to help him find Cassie so he can express his feelings for her. Even with the cast singing Wild World at the end of season 1, Sid was leading the song and it follows him onto his journey to meet Cassie. With season 1 starting with the problem of Sid's virginity, to then leading with Sid falling in love with Cassie, proving that it was more than sex that Sid was searching after, despite that being his initial focus. As time goes by after Tony's accident, Sid has become burnt out from supporting Tony, while he lacks a support system of his own. He and Cassie are now dating, but Cassie's in Scotland and he doesn't know when he'll get the chance to be with her again. This causes Sid to recluse into himself as he feels lost without Tony, Cassie, and even Michelle, who has been avoiding him. While spending less time with his friends, Sid starts to spend more time at home with his dad now that his mom has left. However, Sid is trying his best to keep his family together despite his parents breaking up. When Sid's grandfather comes to town, it's clear that Sid and his dad are more alike than Sid realized, seeing how his father is seen as a disappointment to Sid's grandfather, like Sid is seen as a disappointment to his father. The irony of the situation is that Sid's grandfather has told Sid's dad that he's sick, so Sid's dad is very careful about his relationship with his own father because he doesn't know when it'll be the last time he sees him. This is ironic because when Sid's dad finally tells his own father to fuck off, he ends up dying, leaving Sid's dad's message as an ominous motif. When his dad dies, Sid is in shock and doesn't know what to do. He winds up going to school and not telling anyone what happened. Sid is literally stuck on autopilot until Tony reaches out to Sid and convinces him to go for a drink. This is then followed by Sid revealing to Tony what happened to his dad, and Tony helping him deal with it. Through Tony's actions, we can almost see a return to form for Tony for the first time since his accident, as he plays the God character to Sid's protagonist by guiding him through solving his problem of what to do now that his dad has died. To take it even a step further, Tony reemerging as a God figure in Sid's life is even more apparent when looking at how Sid felt lonely without Cassie, so he began to lean on his family to support him, but once his dad died, he had no one left at home. Going to Tony and breaking down and crying in the middle of their night out resembles a person going to church and praying to their God when they don't know what to do and feel lost. Even when Tony goes home with Sid later, he is the one to convince Sid to go into the living room where his dad's body is, along with shutting Sid's dad's eyes, telling Sid to call someone, and lighting one of Sid's dad's cigarettes. At one moment, Sid says, "Oh Christ," and Tony replies, "Okay."
Oh, Christ. Okay.
Once Sid and Michelle get together, they only stop after Tony starts to act like his old self again and tells Sid that Michelle is his girl and Cassie is Sid's girl. It's like without Tony playing God, Sid doesn't know how to be the protagonist of his own life. This is further shown once Tony tells Sid to get Michelle back for him, and he doesn't know how. So Effie decides she'll sort everything, forcing Sid to sit in her room and creatively explore his emotions for Cassie. As Sid and Cassie are reunited, Sid tries to live in the present and not rock the boat too much with Cassie, but it also keeps him passive while the lives of his friends are actively changing. This worsens as Chris dies and Cassie leaves for New York. All this saddens Sid, and he ends up back leaning on Tony for his support. Sid and Cassie's relationship is really important to both of their developments. For Sid, we can see that Cassie's precarious state forces him to open up to Cassie about his feelings for her, since her feelings for him make him more vulnerable to emotional instability, which isn't great since she's in recovery. So Sid's desire for Cassie follows a similar trajectory as his growth throughout the show, which is a slow burn. Sid tries to attempt Tony's plan and get Cassie high so that she'll have sex with him, except Cassie doesn't want to get high because she doesn't want to get the munchies and be hungry. Sid is very low energy, so he wasn't going to devise an entire new plan to get Cassie to want to sleep with him. So instead of following Tony's plan, he just is himself. During this, Sid begins to genuinely like her for who she is. Sid is more introverted and shy when it comes to sex compared to some of his other friends, but you can see glimpses of Sid wanting to say and do more, but it's like he's waiting for someone to give him permission to act. This is ultimately the main issue in his relationship with Cassie. She clearly is willing to express how she feels about him, but Sid's lust for Michelle constantly holds him back. Once Sid wears off Michelle, he only wants Cassie. Unfortunately, Cassie's dating someone she met at the mental hospital and Sid's too late. Since he can't readily have her anymore, Sid yearns for Cassie for the first time. He starts to see her everywhere and can't get her out of his mind. It's funny because when he was passive, Cassie was there yearning for him, but he was so sprung on Michelle. Sid then calls Cassie and tells her that he wants to meet her, and they do. He then asks multiple times if he can kiss her, and she allows him to and says to not ask her again. But when Michelle calls for Sid to help Tony, Sid asks Cassie for another kiss before he leaves and she says no. In this instance, I think she just wanted Sid to take control for once, because despite calling her to the diner, Cassie was the more assertive one, whereas Sid was more submissive. But as soon as Michelle and Tony need him, he's submissive again. Sid and Cassie are then separated by Cassie's distrust of him, but Sid decides that he loves Cassie and that he needs to be with her. When they do start going out, Sid becomes distrustful of Cassie and thinks she's cheating on him, despite never actually catching her doing anything. He and his dad are also both dealing with issues regarding their relationships, with both Sid's mom and Cassie gone. This is emphasized even further when Sid's mom tells Sid's dad to do something and stop talking, drawing a parallel to how Sid and Cassie's relationship has been hindered by Sid's inaction. Even though Sid's inaction is similar to his father's, it's also similar to his mother when Sid decides to leave Cassie for Michelle after some miscommunication. The only solution to combat Sid's inaction with Cassie is when Effie gets him pissed off enough to where he finally takes some initiative and goes to Cassie and confesses his feelings for her. This removes the element of miscommunication that has kept them apart and for the first time gives them the chance to be together without anyone getting in the way. Despite being with Cassie now, Sid doesn't try to change his behavior to make Cassie feel any more secure, other than saying the occasional "I love you." He constantly reminds her of the fact that he had sex with Michelle, which makes it hard for Cassie to forget and move on. Again, Sid is brutally honest. Sid isn't good at pretending to be something else or someone else, and says what's on his mind. Sid has many instances where he shows some drive and starts to make some decisions in his life, but he can never fully decide for himself, by himself, which makes it hard for him to be seen as the main character that he is. Even at the end, after Chris's funeral, Sid asks Tony where they're going as Tony drives Sid's dad's car, which is probably now Sid's car now that his dad is dead, but even with that, Tony is still driving. This is symbolic of how Tony is back in control of Sid's life and is still guiding him. Tony then gives Sid his passport and a plane ticket and tells him to go to New York for Cassie. Sid's initial reaction to this is to question Tony, noting that Tony told him that Sid and Cassie were over and that he should move on. This is interesting because after everything that went on, Sid still listens to Tony and does what he says. In the first episode of the show, Tony tells Sid he needs to lose his virginity, and so that becomes Sid's mission. Now, in the last episode of the first generation, Tony is still trying to control Sid's sex life, even if it is coming from a better place as he is letting Sid go and allowing him to try to figure out his life on his own. For the next video, we'll be exploring Michelle's character as she is seen as this confident, pretty girl who is a muse for many of the boys in her life. Despite being seen as such, we'll discuss how Michelle is actually quite misunderstood as someone seeking sexual attention when really she's just looking for love in all the wrong places. Peace.